this any way you want.
Okay.
Because I tend to go on sometimes a little long, but it's because I want there to be context in stuff, because so many times you get these one-liners and they really don't tell you anything.
Right.
But if people have if they get a visual image of context, I think it helps helps people understand.
Perfect. All right, and when you speak, just project a little bit, because you're right, you're fine. But
all right.
You're right. Yeah, you just have to do that.
Okay.
Okay, so tell me, Mr. Boyce, just tell me who you are and what you were doing for the Chicago Tribune in 1968.
Well, my name is Joseph Boyce, and I was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, the daily Chicago Tribune at that time. In fact, I was the first person of color and the only person of color at that time to be a reporter for the daily Chicago Tribune on general assignment.
Okay.
I was on general assignment.
Okay, and so on this day, before you actually got to the campus of Northwestern to cover the takeover of the bursar's office and all the social unrest that was happening, what was your idea about Northwestern students? What did you think about them, or Black Northwestern students?
Well, I mean, because I covered so many things, I never really concentrated on them or gave that a lot of thought, except that it was at a time when universities like Northwestern were accepting more Black students and trying to deal with the fact that their culture really didn't support African American students that well, and trying to come to grips with what these changes meant for the university. I think I'd heard of Mr. Taylor before, but as I recall, the sit-in happened on Friday night when the university, basically when that staff in the office went home. That's when the students took over. But I was not assigned to go to Northwestern to cover that until the next day.
Okay. And so what were your thoughts about Northwestern students before that? Did you have any preconceived notions? What was, how did you talk about them or think about them prior to
I knew Northwestern was one of the, more elite institutions in the Chicago area. It was highly regarded for its academic. And my assumption is that any student who was accepted at Northwestern was probably, a cut above the average, and that would include Black students too. I had pledged with a couple of students from Northwestern when I was pledging Alpha, and they were, impressive people. I dated a young woman who was in Northwestern drama, who was African American. She was awfully bright, but that had been years before, but I really didn't, give it a lot of thought.
Okay. So what did you think when you were, tell me, how did you get to the bursar's office? Did you have to negotiate your way in?
Oh, no. It was just another assignment to me. Okay. And when I got there, the press they were assembled outside with the cameras and everything. And so, I stood outside with them. Mm-hmm. Waiting to see what was going to happen. And there were rumors that the Black students, the administration seemed very concerned because they had, I think, recently purchased a big mainframe computer that was in the basement of the building, and they were afraid that the students were going to destroy that computer or in some way damage it. And so that was a major concern. But the students weren't communicating that much with the outside. I think Mr. Turner had submitted a list of demands, and he had sarcastically said, apparently to some question with his demands, an answer to a reporter, "Oh yeah, we want fried chicken and collard greens served in the cafeteria," or something. But it was obviously a sarcastic answer. But this white reporter, they printed it as being one of their serious demands, which kind of trivialized what they were trying to do as far as I was concerned as an African American. So I was concerned about them being misrepresented in the media, which a lot of that was being done by mainstream media when it came to issues involving Blacks. So anyway, I'm standing there with the rest of the press corps, and all of a sudden I'm standing by a window and I hear somebody say, "Psst, psst, psst, psst." I'm looking where it's coming from, and it's coming from inside the building, and it's a young woman inside. She calls me. She said, "Hey," she said, "Who are you?" And I said, I'm Joe Boyce." She said, "Who are you with?" And I said, "The Chicago Tribune." And she said, "So they sent you here," or something like that. I said, "Yeah, I'm covering this." She said, "You want to come inside?" I said, "Yeah." So she opened the window and I crawled inside the building with the students. So I was the only reporter inside with the students. And contrary to what the word was on the outside, that these students were liable to trash the place and hurt the computer, these young people were all studying for their exams. And they were serious about trying to prepare and pass these examinations. It was a serious endeavor, and they had placed 2 people downstairs on the mainframe computer to guard it, to make sure nobody would become overzealous and maybe do some damage to it. So they were very careful. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Mm-hmm. So I talked to some of the students and interviewed them and just hung out with them and try not to interfere with their studying. They had not damaged anything on the premises. They were being very careful. So later on that evening, they decided that the administration decided to accept some of the demands. They reached an agreement. And so the students decided that they would leave the building. And that meant that I would leave the building too. But the administration wanted to come in first and do a walk around of the building to examine it to see what, if any, damage had been done. So I was the only person with the media that was there for that, because I was already inside. And so I could hear these people saying things like, "Oh, this really looks nice in here. They cleaned up." And one person remarks, "They washed the dirty dishes that the staff left on Friday night when they left." So I mean, these students had cleaned up the place and they'd taken good care of it, and in fact improved it from the way the actual staff had left it Friday night. And so the students left the building. I left and found a phone and phoned my story in to a rewrite man at the Tribune because it was getting late. And the next day was Sunday, and the Sunday morning edition is the big edition of every week, you know. And so I phoned my story into a rewrite man who was a buddy of mine, a white guy by the name of Rod Gibson. And I phoned the story in, and then I went home. And later on that night, I got a call, and it was from Rod Gibson. And he said, "I just want you to know that your story is going to lead the front page of the paper tomorrow. And it's going to be under an 8-column banner headline." In those days, Chicago Tribune used to run the big headline, the big news story ran. It was an 8-column headline, went all the way across the paper in big, bold type, big font. And he said, so I said, "Oh, that's nice." And he said, "But I took your name, I took your byline off of it." And I said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Because I didn't think you'd want your name on the story." And I said, "Why not?" He told me that he had written the story according to the way I had phoned it in. And that night, Don Maxwell, who was the top editor of the paper, who also happened to be a Northwestern University trustee, and who was upset that the students had taken over the bursar's office, he happened to be in the newsroom that night. Now that was rare for him on a Saturday, but he happened to be walking in, and I guess somehow he heard that the story had come in, and he wanted to read it. And when he read it, he took it and scratched out the first 3 paragraphs and said, I'll write this myself. And he sat down, and even though he was not on the scene, he didn't report it, he was nowhere near there, he wrote the lead of that story himself to comply with his own biases. And so if you research that story, it's a very, very negative lead. I can't remember the exact words, but it was something like, Northwestern University administrators caved in to demands by militant black students for this. It was very negative. It was very implied criticism of the Northwestern administration for agreeing with these students to go along with some of these demands. And it portrayed these students as some kind of angry, almost violent radicals. And nobody was going to challenge him in that office, and it was a done deal by the time I got the call. So if somebody goes back and looks at that article in the Chicago Tribune, my name is not on it. There's no evidence that I covered it. But the first part of that story has nothing to do with what I reported.
Gotcha.
And that's my story. That's my role.
Okay. So what did you think about what the students were fighting for? What was your understanding of that before you got into the BURSARS office, and what was your understanding of it afterwards?
Well, it's a long time ago, but I think that their claims, as I recall, were pretty much those of a lot of students in majority white institutions at the time, which was they wanted more sensitivity shown to the needs and the issues involving minority students, mainly black students. I think they felt that there should be more black faculty, that when it came to doing graduate studies and so forth, that they wanted to make sure that their academic work wasn't discriminated against, that they wanted more resources on campus to deal with the specific issues of being black on that campus, whether that meant inviting people to the campus that would talk about those issues and debate those issues, or whether it meant making sure, for example, the curricula accurately included the experience, the African American experience. It was not necessarily as Eurocentric as it had been. So I think that, and maybe issues of housing, so I can't remember, everything, because it was some time ago, and I haven't seen a list of their demands since. But they were reasonable, and certainly if there was something that might have been considered unreasonable, I don't think there was anything on that list that could not have been negotiable and worthy of discussion. So I don't think they were out of line at all. And I think, like many other groups at that time, they probably entered the bursar's office after a period of frustration in trying to get a response through the proper channels and failing. Because as so much of the dynamic was in the 1960s, you almost were going to be ignored. You weren't going to get listened to unless you did something they considered, quote, quote, radical. And it wasn't radical at all. It was last resort, because you're not responding to me otherwise. And so, this is how I get your attention. I used to tell my students about when you do a story about the old man and the mule. The guy hired this mule skinner to train his mule, because the mule wouldn't do anything he asked it to. And so the guy, for $10, went to train the mule, and the first thing he did was look around on the ground, pick up a big log, and hit the mule right smack in the middle of the head and knocked him almost out. And the farmer said, "My goodness, you almost killed him. What are you doing? I didn't pay you to do that. I paid you to train the mule." And the guy said, "Yeah, I'm going to train him, But first, you got to get his attention.
So do you have any relationships now with folks at Northwestern or the students there, or?
No, I don't. I have a friend who was a professor there, a very good friend, who still is Alice Palmer. And then I knew Leon Forrest, who'd gone to high school with me, and who was on the faculty there. And I told you about the couple of guys that were in my pledge group. But that's pretty much. I mean, I've met journalists since who graduated from the Northwestern School of Journalism, and I've always been impressed by how they carried themselves and how they did their jobs.
So, is there anything that you'd like to add about your experience on that day?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was significant that this young woman realized that maybe the coverage that they were going to get, and the other students too, otherwise I wouldn't have been allowed to come in, was they realized that the coverage they were going to get might be a little bit more balanced if they had somebody involved who maybe understood a little bit more about where they were coming from. And you have to remember at that time, black journalists with mainstream white media were almost non-existent. We all knew each other, those of us who worked for mainstream white media back in the 60s, across the country. We all knew each other. You could count us on your fingers. There was no NABJ. There were no black journalism groups. It was word of mouth. We knew each other, but we also knew the kind of job we had to do. And that's not necessarily being biased when we reported about issues concerning black people. All you had to do was really tell the truth. The truth was sufficient in itself. And I think by her inviting me in that building, she was hoping that that would be an outcome. And obviously the other students in there must have gone along with her with that idea, or they would have told me, no, you can't come in, she made a mistake, you gotta go. And they didn't. They were very accommodating. And and we're talking about students who were serious, who were smart, who had, every academic and social reason to be accepted at Northwestern University. They could perform on a level of anybody else. It gives some people comfort to think that black students are in institutions like Northwestern because of somebody's big-heartedness and largesse. That they're really not qualified to be there, but they're there because of affirmative action. That's a racist concept. It just makes me feel better if I have that concept, because I'm not threatened. But the fact of the matter was, the impression I got from those students is they had not only every right to be at Northwestern, but probably any other institution in the United States. They were a cut above, and they were good young people. And Northwestern was doggone lucky to have them.
Thank you. Oh my goodness.